In 105 years of life, Brooke Astor was married 3 times, outlived 2 of her husbands, and escaped the third only through his death. She spent nearly 4 decades giving away one of the largest private fortunes in New York, almost none of it to her own family. By the end of her life, she was known across the city simply as the First Lady of New York, a woman who had dined with presidents, funded half the borough's libraries, and turned a marriage she had barely wanted into the greatest philanthropic project of the 20th century. And in her final years, in an apartment 3 blocks from the museums she had helped build, she was, according to her own grandson, sleeping on a couch stained by the illness of her elderly dog, in a room with peeling paint and torn curtains, while the people responsible for her care argued in court over what was left of her money. 3 marriages, 3 completely different kinds of survival. The first nearly broke her before she turned 30. The second gave her the only real peace she ever found. The third made her one of the richest widows in America and cost her almost everything she had spent her life learning to protect. Before we get into how a 17-year-old bride from a military family ended up there, if you want the real history behind the galas and the headlines rather than just the highlight reel, go ahead and subscribe now. It costs nothing, and it means you will not miss what happens later in this story, because it gets far stranger than the parties ever led on. Brooke Astor was born Roberta Brooke Russell on the 30th of March, 1902, in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Her father, John Henry Russell Jr., was a Marine Corps officer who would eventually rise to commandant, the highest rank in the entire Corps. Her mother, Mabel Howard Russell, came from a comfortable but far from extravagant family and insisted, wherever the Russells landed, on proper manners and a properly maintained wardrobe, even when the money to maintain it was thin. That distinction mattered. Brooke did not grow up rich. She grew up genteel, in a household that moved constantly and lived on an officer's income, a fact that would shape almost every choice she made once she was old enough to choose. A military career does not sit still, and neither did the Russells. By the time Brooke was a teenager, the family had already lived in Hawaii, in the Panama Canal Zone, in Washington, and in Peking, where her father was posted with the legation guard in the years after the Boxer Rebellion. She grew up at dinner tables full of diplomats, foreign officers, and visiting generals, absorbing a skill that would define the rest of her life long before she understood what it was worth: how to read a room, how to make herself useful to the people inside it, and how to hold herself with the composure of someone far wealthier than she actually was. She read constantly, wrote from an early age, and later called her childhood a patchwork, a phrase she eventually used as the title of one of her memoirs. It fit. She had no fixed home, and no single city she could call her own. In Peking, still a girl, she watched foreign legations conduct the delicate business of post-war diplomacy in a city that had, within living memory, been the site of a siege. It was an unusual education for an American child, closer to something out of a novel than to the ordinary upbringing of most girls her age, and she absorbed it the way children absorb things they do not yet know are extraordinary. Her mother pushed her toward writing as well as manners, and Brooke was submitting short pieces to magazines while she was still a teenager, an early sign of the literary ambitions that would eventually produce 2 memoirs and 2 novels. None of it, though, changed the basic math of her situation. She was a bright, well-traveled, well-mannered young woman with almost no money of her own, arriving into a Washington social season full of families who had considerably more. What she did have, by the time the family settled back in Washington in her late teens, was a face, a bearing, and a fluency in high society that made much older, much richer men take notice. One of them was John Dryden Kuser. Kuser came from a wealthy and politically connected New Jersey family. His father sat in the state Senate and had money in early telephone utilities, and, through a personal stake in the fledgling movie business, in what would become Fox Film. To a mother raising a daughter on a Marine officer's salary, the match looked close to perfect. Young, rich, well-placed in exactly the world she wanted her daughter to enter. Brooke herself was 17, and by her own later account, she barely understood what marriage meant when she agreed to it. She had spent her whole childhood learning to please rooms full of powerful adults, and Kuser, at that moment, looked like the reward for having learned the lesson well. They married in 1919, and Brooke moved from a household that counted every dollar into one of the wealthiest family compounds in New Jersey, complete with servants, stables, and a social calendar built entirely around other rich families. For a 17-year-old who had spent her childhood watching her mother stretch a Marine officer's paycheck, the shift must have felt less like a marriage and more like a rescue. It did not stay that way for long. It went wrong almost immediately. Kuser drank heavily, and according to Brooke's own later writing, he was violent when he drank, striking her more than once over the course of the marriage. He was also, by most accounts that survive him, chronically unfaithful, carrying on affairs with a casualness that suggested he never expected consequences. Brooke stayed anyway, for more than a decade, partly because divorce in her social world still carried real and lasting shame, and partly because in 1924 she had given birth to their only child, a son she named Anthony Dryden Marshall. A young mother with no independent income of her own did not walk away from a Kuser lightly, whatever was happening behind closed doors. Like many women of her class and era who wanted out of a marriage quickly, she eventually traveled to obtain the divorce, under more permissive residency laws than New York offered, a common route for unhappy wealthy couples at the time. She finally did it in 1930, ending the marriage after 11 years. She was 28 years old, a divorced single mother in a social class that did not yet know quite what to do with divorced single mothers, holding custody of a 6-year-old boy and very little money of her own, since the Kuser fortune, and the comfort that came with it, belonged to the Kuser name far more than it ever belonged to her. It was, by any measure, a frightening position to be in. It was also the moment she learned the central lesson of her adult life. A good name and a large fortune were not the same thing as safety, and she had just spent 11 years proving it the hard way. 2 years later, in 1932, she married again, this time to a stockbroker named Charles Marshall, whom everyone who knew him called Buddy. There was no fortune attached to this marriage the way there had been with Kuser, and by every account that survives, it was the happiest relationship of Brooke's life. Buddy Marshall was steady where Kuser had been volatile, and warm where her first husband had been cruel. Brooke took his surname, and her son from the first marriage grew up as Anthony Marshall, the name he would carry for the rest of his life, including through the criminal trial that would one day send him to prison. The Marshalls lived well within their means, in a household that was modest by the standards of the families Brooke would later marry into, and by several accounts she preferred it that way. After the volatility of the Kuser years, an ordinary, unremarkable domestic life read to her less like a compromise and more like a genuine relief. The Marshall years were also the years Brooke built something closer to a career of her own. She worked for a period as an editor at House and Garden magazine, developing a professional identity that had nothing to do with any husband's name or fortune, and continued writing, an interest that had followed her since childhood. Her son Tony grew up in a household that was, for once, calm, and went on to serve as a Marine officer in the Second World War, fighting at Iwo Jima, where he was wounded and decorated for bravery. After the war, Tony built a career that, on paper, looked distinguished by any standard. He served in the State Department and, for a period, in intelligence work, before going on to serve as United States ambassador to more than one country. including postings in Africa and the Caribbean. Later in life, after leaving government service, he reinvented himself again as a Broadway producer, backing a string of theatrical productions in New York. It is worth sitting with all of that for a moment, given what would happen between mother and son more than 60 years later. The boy she raised through her first marriage's wreckage grew into a decorated soldier, then a diplomat entrusted with representing his country abroad, then a man of the theater, long before he became the man capable of something else entirely. The marriage to Buddy Marshall lasted 20 years. Brooke, later in life, described this period as the one stretch of her adulthood in which she felt simply and completely loved, without complication and without performance. Nothing went wrong between them. The marriage ended only because, in 1952, Buddy Marshall died of a heart attack. Brooke was 50 years old. She had already survived one marriage that nearly broke her and one that had slowly repaired her. She had no way of knowing that the third would be the one that made her famous, and that it would ask something entirely different of her than either of the first two. She married Vincent Astor in 1953, less than a year after Buddy Marshall's death. Vincent was the last direct heir of the Astor real estate fortune, a family line stretching back to John Jacob Astor, the fur trader who had become, at one point, the richest man in the United States. Across several generations, the family had converted that early fortune into an enormous portfolio of New York City property, including some of Manhattan's most prestigious hotels, and, in an earlier and less flattering chapter of the family's history, some of its most notorious slum tenements. By the time it reached Vincent, the Astor name meant both extraordinary wealth and a certain amount of public unease about how that wealth had been made. Vincent Astor was, by nearly every account left by people who knew him, a genuinely difficult man. This was his third marriage as well. Both of his previous marriages had ended in divorce, and several of Brooke's friends warned her against him before the wedding. He was moody, controlling about small domestic matters most husbands never think to control, and prone to sudden fits of temper that could empty a room in minutes. Brooke, according to people who observed the marriage up close, learned to manage him the same way she had once learned to manage rooms full of generals and diplomats as a child, watching for the first small signs of a mood shifting and adjusting the conversation, the seating, or the subject before it could turn into something worse. It was not romance in any conventional sense. It was a skill she had been building since she was 12 years old, finally put to its hardest use yet. He was also a man of odd, restless enthusiasms. He had owned and personally run Newsweek magazine since the 1930s, treating it less like an investment and more like a hobby he took seriously. He had spent much of his earlier adulthood as a yachtsman and amateur scientist, hosting cruises and fishing expeditions aboard his ship, the Normahal, whose guests over the years had included a young Franklin Roosevelt, long before Roosevelt became president. And underneath the moodiness, he was, in his own contradictory way, serious about philanthropy, having founded the Vincent Astor Foundation years before he ever met Brooke, with a stated purpose, in his own words, of relieving human suffering. Brooke later admitted, in writing, that she had not married him out of love the way she had loved Buddy Marshall. She married him because he asked, because she respected the seriousness he brought to his giving, and because, at 51 years old, already once divorced and once widowed, she had already learned that love was not the only reasonable foundation for a marriage. Neither of them had children together. By most accounts, Vincent never had children with any of his 3 wives, which meant that, whatever happened to his fortune when he died, it would not be divided among sons and daughters of his own. The marriage lasted 6 years, and not all of them were easy. Then, in 1959, Vincent Astor died of a heart attack. He left Brooke roughly $67 million, and full control of the Vincent Astor Foundation. Whether he intended it this way or not, he had just handed her the beginning of the only identity she would ever build entirely on her own, without a husband's name doing the work for her. If you want to see where a widow with $67 million and no real plan turns into one of the most consequential philanthropists in New York's history, stay with this one, because the next 40 years are the part of Brooke Astor's story most people never hear. And if this is landing with you, tell us in the comments which of the 3 marriages you think shaped her the most. It genuinely helps decide what we cover next. The Vincent Astor Foundation's purpose, in Vincent's own stated language, was to relieve human suffering. Brooke ran it for nearly 4 decades, from 1959 until 1997, when she made the deliberate decision to give away the last of its endowment and close the foundation entirely rather than let it drift on for generations without her direct hand on it. Over those 38 years, the foundation gave away close to $200 million, almost all of it inside New York City. She funded branches of the New York Public Library, including a gift of roughly $10 million toward renovating 2 of the reading rooms at the main branch on Fifth Avenue. She funded a children's zoo at the Bronx Zoo. She funded homeless shelters, senior centers, hospital wings, and small neighborhood organizations that most donors of her wealth and standing would never have bothered visiting in person. She gave toward the restoration of Central Park during years when the park had fallen into visible disrepair, and toward projects at the American Museum of Natural History and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where she sat on the board for decades and pushed, often successfully, for money to go toward institutions serving neighborhoods far from Fifth Avenue. That last detail was what set her apart from other society philanthropists of her era. She visited the projects herself, in person, often with little notice, dressed in what her friends described as a uniform of understated but obviously expensive suits, and she was known to walk away from a grant application entirely if the site visit did not match what had been written on the paperwork. Staff at the foundation later described her personally touring a rundown community center in the South Bronx in her 70s, climbing stairs past broken lighting fixtures to see the top floor for herself before agreeing to fund the repairs, at a point in her life when almost nobody would have questioned her sending a deputy instead. By the 1970s and 80s, she had become, in the language of the New York press, the First Lady of New York, a title with no official meaning and enormous social weight behind it. She threw parties covered by the papers, with the seriousness usually reserved for state visits. She sat on the boards of the Metropolitan Museum and the New York Public Library. She counted Henry Kissinger, David Rockefeller, and 2 generations of the city's wealthiest families among her close friends. She published 2 memoirs, Patchwork Child and Footprints, along with 2 novels, and hosted dinners where a United States senator might sit 2 seats from a young novelist she had decided to champion, because she treated new writers with the same seriousness she gave old money, a habit that made her genuinely well-liked rather than merely well-attended. By nearly every public measure, she had built exactly the kind of life a frightened 28-year-old divorced mother could never have imagined for herself back in 1930. She never remarried after Vincent Astor's death, spending the next 48 years of her life as a widow by choice as much as by circumstance. In 1998, President Bill Clinton awarded her the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the country's highest civilian honor, in recognition of nearly 4 decades spent giving away the fortune 3 marriages had, in their very different ways, put into her hands. Even into her 90s, she kept a full calendar, attending openings, hosting dinners, and giving interviews, in which she came across as sharp, funny, and entirely in command of herself. Friends who saw her at 95 described a woman still correcting other people's grammar at the dinner table and still personally reading the thank you letters that came in response to her grants. It made what followed harder for almost everyone who knew her to process, because there was no gradual public softening they could point to later. To the world outside her household, she simply seemed to be Brooke Astor, and then, within a few years, she was gone from public view entirely. Underneath the galas, though, she was getting old, and the family she had built around herself, mostly her son from that first, difficult marriage, was becoming the most dangerous part of her entire story. By the year 2000, when Brooke was in her late 90s, Anthony Marshall had confirmed publicly that his mother had Alzheimer's disease, news that spread through New York society, first as whispers, then openly. As her memory and independence declined over the following years, control of her daily life and her finances passed increasingly to Anthony, by then, in his late 70s, and functioning as both her primary caretaker and the manager of her estate. His third wife, Charlene, was widely reported at the time to have real sway over his decisions during this period. Family members and former staff later told investigators and reporters that Charlene had pushed Anthony to ask his mother for larger gifts, additional properties, and higher compensation for managing her affairs, though Charlene herself was never criminally charged in connection with any of it. The extent of her actual influence remained, and still remains, disputed. Concern had been building for a while before anyone went to court. Longtime friends noticed Brooke stopped appearing at events she had never missed in 50 years, that phone calls went unreturned, and that on the rare occasions they were allowed to see her, she seemed thinner, more confused, and strangely unwilling to speak freely with them in the room. Philip Marshall, Anthony's own son and Brooke's grandson, was a college professor with no history of public confrontation with his father, which made his decision to act all the more striking to the people who knew the family. In 2006, he filed an emergency petition in New York court asking to have his father removed as her guardian. What he alleged made front-page news across the city for weeks. He said his grandmother, a woman with a fortune once worth well over $100 million, was living in conditions far beneath anything that fortune could explain. Peeling paint, torn curtains, and a couch, stained and smelling from the illness of her elderly dog, on which she was reportedly forced to sleep because her own bedroom had gone unmaintained. He alleged her medical care had been scaled back to save money, that longtime household staff had been let go, that the heat in her Park Avenue apartment was kept low even in cold weather, and that a woman worth well over $100 million was reportedly being served the same cheap congealed oatmeal for meals, rather than the fresh food her household had always provided. He also alleged that visits from her oldest friends, people who had known her for 50 years or more, were being restricted, possibly to keep them from seeing the condition she was actually in. The petition became front-page news within days, and for a woman who had spent 70 years cultivating exactly the kind of discretion her social class prized above almost everything else, the public exposure was its own particular humiliation. The case drew in some of the most influential people in New York. David Rockefeller and Annette de la Renta, both close friends of Brooke Astor for decades, publicly supported the guardianship petition and helped push it through the courts. The court moved quickly. Anthony Marshall was removed as his mother's guardian. J.P. Morgan Chase was appointed to oversee her financial affairs, and Annette de la Renta was named guardian of her person. Some of the friends who had been kept away were finally allowed back into her apartment in her final months, and by most accounts, her final year of life was far more comfortable than the year immediately before the petition was filed, even as her Alzheimer's continued its own separate and irreversible decline. She died on the 13th of August, 2007, at Holly Hill, her home in Briarcliff Manor, New York. She was 105 years old. Her memorial service drew a cross-section of New York that few funerals ever manage. museum directors, former ambassadors, librarians from branches she had personally funded, and ordinary staff members from the shelters and community centers she had insisted on visiting herself over the decades. The city she had spent nearly 70 years rebuilding, one grant at a time, turned out in force to mark the end of it. Her death did not end the story. She left behind an estate still worth well over $100 million, even after nearly 4 decades of giving money away, and the fight over that remaining fortune had, in fact, started before she died. 2 years earlier, in 2004, a codicil, a legal amendment to her will, had been added, redirecting a large portion of her estate toward her son, rather than the charities she had spent her life supporting. Prosecutors alleged that Anthony Marshall and the estate lawyer who drafted the document, Francis Morrissey, had taken advantage of her declining mental state to push it through while she was no longer capable of fully understanding what she was signing. One of the central pieces of evidence at trial involved a valuable painting from her collection, sold for a price far below independent appraisals, with Marshall and an art dealer allegedly splitting an inflated commission on the sale. A grand jury indicted Anthony Marshall a few months after his mother's death, in November of 2007. The trial that followed ran for months and became one of the most closely watched criminal cases New York had seen in years, less for its violence, since there was none, than for what it revealed about how easily even a fortune the size of Brooke Astor's could be drained by the very people closest to her. Philip Marshall, the grandson whose petition had first exposed the case, testified against his own father during the proceedings, a detail that made an already unusual trial feel, at moments, closer to a family tragedy playing out in a courtroom than a conventional white-collar case. In 2009, a jury convicted Anthony Marshall on multiple counts, including grand larceny, conspiracy, and scheme to defraud, for improperly taking money from his mother's accounts while she was alive and no longer able to give informed consent. Francis Morrissey was convicted separately of forgery for his role in drafting and validating the disputed will amendment. At sentencing, Marshall's lawyers pointed to his decorated service at Iwo Jima 6 decades earlier, arguing that the same man who had once been wounded defending his country deserved leniency in his old age. It did little to change the outcome. Marshall was sentenced to 1 to 3 years in prison. Appeals and his own declining health delayed the sentence for years, and he did not actually enter prison until 2013, in his late 80s. He was released on medical parole after roughly a year behind bars, suffering from Parkinson's disease and several other serious illnesses, and he died a few months later, in November of 2014, the same year he was released. The case, widely covered as one of the most prominent elder financial abuse prosecutions in the country's history, left behind it a renewed public conversation in New York about how guardianship law should protect the very wealthy and the very poor in exactly the same way, since money, as Brooke Astor's own final years had shown, bought no protection at all once the people closest to her decided to take advantage of it. A settlement reached a few years after the conviction eventually redirected much of the disputed money back toward the charities and institutions Brooke had spent her life supporting. The outcome, in the end, closer to the one she would probably have chosen for herself, had anyone thought to ask her while she still could have answered. Brooke Astor spent 105 years learning how to survive other people. She survived a violent first husband by outlasting the marriage and rebuilding herself afterward with almost nothing. She survived losing the one man she genuinely loved by turning his memory into 20 years of steady, useful devotion to a fortune that was not even hers yet. She survived a difficult third husband by outliving him and inheriting the platform his money gave her, and she used that platform to build the one identity in her life that belonged entirely to her, independent of any of the three names she carried over the course of her marriages. What she could not survive, in the end, was her own family, the one relationship she had never chosen for herself, and could not simply divorce or outlive the way she had handled the other three. A woman who had spent decades mastering the exact skill her military childhood taught her, reading a room, making herself indispensable inside it, protecting herself inside it, spent her final years in a room she could no longer read at all, cared for by people whose intentions she was no longer capable of judging. 3 marriages, 3 husbands, 3 completely different men, and in the end, none of that preparation was built for the one relationship she had never learned how to walk away from. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.